I've entitled my talk for today, A Transforming Light. And I think the reason for that title will quickly become clear. We'll be looking at Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verses 28 to 43. On this last Sunday, before the start of Lent, many churches celebrate Transfiguration Sunday, commemorating the occasion on which Jesus was transformed into an angelic-type being in front of his three most famous disciples. Had they ever previously doubted, that experience convinced Peter, James, and John that Jesus was indeed a holy being. Without diminishing the spectacular nature of Jesus' transfiguration, Luke, the writer, drew special attention to the reaction of Peter, James, and John. The three disciples were so caught off guard that they struggled to respond to the holy event. We're not surprised by their bumbling response. Encountering holiness can be intimidating. Being in the presence of holiness inevitably causes people to act unusually, and it doesn't take something as dramatic as a burning bush or a transfigured Jesus. We instinctively make rules about how to act around objects, places, or people which we associate with holiness. The book we follow as Christians is entitled the Holy Bible, and even people who have never read it treat it differently than other books, using it for swearing-in purposes and for promising to tell the truth in courts. When people enter places of worship, they universally leave certain behaviors and vocabulary at the entrance. In essence, we tend to act as if holiness takes away our freedom to act normally. But what if it should be the other way around? What if we viewed holiness as a guide to our normal behavior? Well, here's what happened at the transfiguration of Jesus, according to Luke 9, 28 to 36, on what has traditionally been accepted as Mount Tabor. This is what it says. About 8 days after this, and that after this is that Jesus had announced his upcoming death. So after about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. Two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. Now, it's helpful to note that, as I mentioned as I began reading, that Jesus' last recorded words in Luke's Gospel prior to the Transfiguration experience were to predict his death. As a result, a good reason to look forward to Lent from the perspective of the Transfiguration is because it features one of 2 mountains which framed Jesus' final ministry leading to his death. It has been said that on the Mount of Transfiguration, we see the Jesus we want. There, Jesus was sanitary. He was invigorating, inviting those who witnessed the transfiguration to experience his glory. The transfiguration was the classic mountaintop experience, which Peter, John, and James did not want to leave, as illustrated by the suggestion of putting up some tabernacles, some tents, some structures. It was also an experience which was, to the disciples' great disappointment, very short-lived. That's how mountaintop experiences typically work. The other mountain which frames the end of Lent is Mount Calvary, and there people have suggested we see the Jesus we get. Rather than displaying brilliant heavenly robes on Mount Calvary, Jesus wore a crown of thorns and was covered in very human blood and gore. His bloody robe was likewise degraded to becoming a cruel gambling prize. Unlike the special nature of following Jesus up the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus' disciples were mostly absent while Jesus ascended Mount Calvary. There's nothing comfortable about a Jesus who invites others to embrace sacrifice. But sacrifice would become a defining characteristic of Jesus' followers. Significantly, Jesus did not stay long on either mountain. We are left asking this question: how do we connect the Jesus of the Mount of Transfiguration with the Jesus we see crucified on Mount Calvary? Like Jesus' disciples, because we find the Mount of Transfiguration Jesus to be more inviting than the Jesus of Mount Calvary, we struggle to draw that connection. Nevertheless, since we can be confident that it was the same Jesus on both mountains, we do well to connect the two. So let's try to do that. As we look at the Mount of Transfiguration event, we see that while Jesus was praying, his whole being became as bright as lightning, and he was joined by two important figures from Israel's history. The fact that the long-dead Moses and Elijah appeared in glorious splendor proved that this was a holy event. Bible students agree that Moses represented God's holy law. You can think 10 Commandments along with all of the other laws, while Elijah represented God's holy prophets. It's also been long understood that Moses and Elijah's appearance with Jesus was meant to affirm that Jesus was the holy fulfillment of both God's holy law and the holy prophets. Being a holy event, we should expect it to reveal truths about the nature of holiness. As we link the Mount of Transfiguration episode to other scriptures, we understand, I think, that holiness is the change that light brings to darkness. Throughout the Bible, a contrast is drawn between light and darkness. For instance, early in John's Gospel, he wrote, "The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it." That was in John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 5. Later on in his first epistle, also chapter 1, verse 5, John wrote this, "God is light. In him there is no darkness at all." The Apostle Paul, in writing to the Ephesians, stated, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the world." That's Ephesians 5, verse 8. Because of the association of light with holiness and darkness with evil, it's no wonder that the world turned dark in the middle of the day during Jesus' crucifixion, and that's noted in Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, verse 44. Jesus himself chastised the religious leaders who had him arrested by telling them, "Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour when darkness reigns." That's in Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, verse 53. The inevitable conclusion is that the Jesus who became like lightning on the Mount of Transfiguration brought the light of his holiness to a dark world on Mount Calvary. Combining the experience of the two mountains reminds us that holiness is not so much about being in a particular place or at a particular event, but it's about the light that we bring with us. Like Peter, James, and John on the Mount of Transfiguration, the mistaken assumption we so easily make is that holiness is only something we encounter rather than light that we bring with us. If we view holiness as something we encounter through being in a particular place or with a particular person, a couple of things will happen. First, we will experience holiness as something which takes away our freedom to act normally. We will be like Peter, who fumbled for a way to react. Second, our experience with holiness will last only as long as we stay in that particular set of circumstances. The uplifting experience from our encounter with holiness will evaporate as soon as we leave the particular set of circumstances. In fact, that was exactly the experience of Peter, John, and James immediately upon their descent from the Mount of Transfiguration. This is what happened the very next day as we continue on, looking at Luke's Gospel, chapter 9, verses 37 to 43. The next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." "You unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." Even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the impure spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. Poor Peter, John, and James. They had no sooner returned from the most glorious experience of their lives, and they were crushed by the darkness of evil in the form of a spirit who was destroying the life of a child. Even worse, Jesus appeared to include them in his rebuke about a perverse and unbelieving generation. What had gone wrong? I suspect it had to do with their view of holiness. Because they had associated holiness with an event, holiness didn't help them when they ran up against the dark reality of their world. Jesus, on the other hand, was able to positively respond to the dark situation they encountered because his very life was the light of holiness. That light of holiness would continue to empower Jesus throughout the dark days leading up to his crucifixion. There's an important lesson here. God doesn't intend us to connect holiness to places or events or people, because then holiness will only impact us as long as we are in that place, event, or with those particular people. Holiness is rather meant to be a light which illuminates the dark times we encounter in life. Far from robbing us of the freedom to act normally, genuine holiness will give us confidence to normally act in ways which will improve whatever situation we find ourselves in. Flipping this idea, we can also say that we bring holiness with us whenever we bring light to a dark situation. It's what we see in Jesus, and it's the reality God wants us to experience.